welcome to the Weird Corner. I am Emily Ashley Cooper and this is Death Rambles, where I ramble about death, funnily enough. And welcome, come in, take a seat, get a drink. I have a coffee in my little skeleton Death Rambles mug that I made for myself. And let's begin. So today we're going to talk about the history of funerals. I will put the fun back in funerals, that's my goal. Because over the time there's been a different attitude towards death and funeral practices that are done today. So I'm going to talk about it. It's really interesting. I'm talking from a UK perspective currently for this video because that is where I am, and the book I use for my reference as well is based on UK history. So the book I'm using today is Traditions of Death and Burial by Dr. Helen Frisbee. It's an amazing book. I really recommend if you like reading about this kind of thing, which you potentially do if you are here. We're going to start from about 1066. We're starting with written history because I could go in depth about different burial practices of different groups in prehistory, but then it gets a little messy and I want to focus on the practice of funerals itself today. So, I know I said from 1066, but we're talking kind of, you know, the Normans have just invaded, blah blah blah. So it's the mid-1200s, and during this time the concept of purgatory became a very big thing. It was kind of like a focus on limbo, and because of this there was kind of the attitude that you had to have a good death to ensure that you could get to heaven. So this is the start of our funeral, because when we have things like the Black Death, for example, death was usually unexpected or unplanned. And yeah, we know that people would die from the plague, but people would drop down suddenly, and that created a big fear around dying, especially because these people could not create themselves a good death. They were gonna either be in purgatory or go to hell because they did not have a good death. You see things about, you know, family being involved in the death process to ensure that the person who was dying had the best death they possibly could. When a person would pass, bells would be rung to indicate the age and the sex usually of the person who had died. And you see quite frequently that women are the people who would take care of the bodies after death. Whereas now, or kind of the 1900s onwards, I'd say, it kind of became men's work. I say this in quotes, by the way. Whereas back in this time, so the 1200s, it was women that were responsible for washing the body, you know, cleansing them, almost as a final act of care, spiritually and physically, before the person was buried. It also is kind of like because obviously at this time Christianity was the main religion in the UK, and it was kind of a reference to the baptism, you know, being christened. It normally happens when you're a baby, and then obviously this is the one before you go on to wherever after you pass away. And we had traditions of wakes or waking. So this kind of, at this point in time, it would kind of be the family watching over the body, but they would have like food and drink, you know, and try and keep it a little bit joyful to try and combat the sadness of losing a loved one. Candles would be lit, salt would be put around the body to protect it, as well as the people being in the room. From this, then the burial would happen. So after the Normans invaded, we saw that church grounds were frequently being used for the burial, but you did have to pay for the privilege of being buried in the church grounds, because of course you did. We see in rural communities the kind of, because obviously not everywhere's going to have a church nearby, so you have to walk a little bit. So in these rural communities we see things called corpse roads. Some of them still exist today, you can walk on them. I think it's quite popular and quite common in Yorkshire to see this kind of thing, because obviously it's not easy to get a horse and cart, for example, down some of these areas. People would have to carry the coffins to the church to be buried. Once the coffins had been taken to the burial site for the funeral, the deceased person's belongings would be given out. It's kind of referred to as a dole. So like clothing items and money would be given out to the mourners, along with food. Food has a very big kind of focus in this time and later on. Kind of food at the funeral is one of the main themes throughout. We didn't really have kind of like a set out funeral plan during this time up until the Reformation. This is when things started to become more formalised, and it's like, oh yeah, you normally do this for a funeral service, rather than people kind of being like, yeah, this is our family member, we cry, we eat food, we drink alcohol, we bury them. Basically it was a 2-day service. So the priests would, you know, do this one ceremony, and then the person would be buried the day after. And some of these things that we see are still done today as someone who has been to a few funerals in my time. So the priest would mark the grave in the shape of a cross, normally, and then also bless the grave with holy water. At this time, burials were normally in an east-facing direction, because the north was seen as evil and associated with hell. So a lot of the time, if people were buried in a north-facing grave, it was because they've either sinned, they could be an outsider potentially. So during the mass of this funeral, candles would be lit and incense would be used in an anti-clockwise direction. That probably looks clockwise on there, but I was doing it my anti-clockwise, I promise. At this time as well, coffins weren't typically buried. We didn't really see coffin burials, because coffins would be taken to the burial site, but the body in its shroud would be taken out of the coffin, then buried in its shroud, rather than the coffin being buried too. You would see things being added into the grave, like crosses, sometimes scrolls with different prayers and things written on. I think sometimes they did it with absolution and that kind of thing. And then some holy water and obviously sprinkling dirt. We still do sprinkling dirt today, or at least when I went to someone being buried, I remember putting stuff in the grave. I printed out some pictures of the Red Sea, because my granddad used to be a diver and he used to dive there quite frequently, so I printed out some pictures of the Red Sea and like the fish and stuff in there and buried it, or put it with with his ashes so he could be buried with it. And then I remember the bowl being passed around and sprinkling dirt. As I said, like, a focus on food. There was a focus on food for after funerals. People would leave loads of money behind to make sure they could pay for this funeral food. And there was a case where one man left more money for his funeral food than he did like money for his daughter after he died. Which, I mean, I think you can see where his priorities were. And we didn't really have a traditional kind of tombstone or gravestone at this point. The grave markers were normally perishable, especially if it was an everyday person. So they were like made out of wood and things like this, so they obviously didn't necessarily survive however many hundred years. And you would get regular everyday people being buried outside, whereas if you were rich enough you could be buried inside a church. You see it today, there are tombs and kind of the big stone slabs you see on the bottom, like on a church floor, that will actually be gravestones. Or you have the big fancy ones that kind of you physically can visibly see are tombs, but obviously they were only for the rich. Later on, we're going between the 1500 and 1750 now. So, as I said previously, we had a focus on having a good death. This was still important, but rather socially than spiritually. So there was more social expectation to make sure your death was good, rather than whether you needed a good death to get into heaven or not. Which puts a lot of pressure on a person, I'd say. You don't want to get hated on in your death for not dying well. So at this time as well, wills were still written on the deathbed, which from a practical sense it doesn't really make that much sense, but you know, it was the 1500s, I'll let them off. We were still having burial shrouds and burial clothes. At this time though, we're talking kind of the 1600s, there was a law put in place, and it is called the Burial in Wool Act. There was 3 of them, I believe, throughout the 1600s, and these were to make sure that burial clothes were made out of wool to help the wool industry, rather than, you know, other things that you had. If you did not do this, you could be fined. So if you're not in Kashmir, I'm sorry, you got pay up the money. We still have the concept of waking, you know, staying with the body the night before the burial, that kind of thing. But now it was for more of a practical reason than a spiritual one too. And that was because at this time we had people that were kind of known as suck 'em up men. And these were people who were grave robbers, basically. They would steal freshly dead bodies and sell them to medical schools. Links into my previous video. So basically you would just stay up to make sure your loved one didn't get stolen during this time, because people might rob your nan. Literally rob your nan. Not take her things, take your nan. At this time though, we did have a very interesting kind of practice, and it's known as sin eating. So this has been used, I think, in kind of horror tropes for a while, but it was an actual practice. So there was a person who would take on the sins of the dead person. So what would happen is salt would be placed on the body, and a plate of food would be passed over the body from normally a female relative of the dead, and it would be passed over to a person. So this plate had food on it. The sin eater would then eat the food as a way of taking on the sins of the dead, which is a fascinating idea, and I want to know who came up with it. They didn't have to eat all the food, by the way. They just had to have a little bit. With our funerals today, a lot of people still get embalmed, which has been a common practice for a while. But back then, embalming didn't really exist at this time period, so bodies had to be buried pretty quickly, otherwise they would decompose. And bodies are gross. Bodies are gross when they're decomposing. Gross. There was a case of I think a priest being fined because he did not bury a body a couple of days after the person had died in hot weather. At this time as well, to try and stop just people turning up to a funeral, because at this time things were still being given out as the dole, you know, clothes, money, shoes of the deceased. And then rich people decided to start ticketing funerals, basically inviting people to go. And you could only go if you had a ticket. And with this as well, you see guests at the funerals being given wine or liquor with different spices in. There's a wine commonly known as burnt wine, which would be an alcohol with different spices in it. And cake. You got cake as well. At this time as well, we see like the pallbearers, like the coffin bearers. They would normally match the age and gender of the deceased. So it's been noted on occasion that you would see pregnant women with the pall of the women who died in childbirth. This was kind of like a black shroud that we put over the coffin. So you normally have children being a pallbearer, 4 children carrying a coffin to its funeral, which is crazy to think about now, really. So as well as this, if you were an unmarried woman, you'd go through a bride's burial, which was kind of a wedding and a funeral in one. So you'd be buried in a white dress, and there's like a, what is it called? It's almost like this big sculpture thing that was made of white. I think they use flowers as well and things. So they used to be placed on top of the grave once it was covered, and then later on they started getting buried in with the coffin. And we see from the 1680s that black fabric in tailors' shops was more and more common for funeral clothes, so people could have specific clothes to wear to the funerals, as we didn't necessarily still have colours that were worn. But in future funerals you do see people being very specific with what colours they want worn, but at this time it was mostly black. And in this time period as well, we see more frequent tombstones and gravestones, and obviously the rich people go for fancy ones because they can afford it, whereas regular poor people would just have their standard burial marker that we've seen before, or they were unmarked. Now we're talking about the range of 1750 to 1900 now, and at this time, you know, we've got slowly the Industrial Revolution. We are having crazy amounts of population growth. Like, we've got infant mortality rates up here, and with this, funerals had to be a bit quicker. And we had loads of diseases like typhoid and cholera and other bad things that were also increasing the mortality rate, as well as kids just dying early. So churchyards were struggling to keep up with these burials. Like, it was frequent death. And then there was an urge to make graveyards pretty. I don't know if you've been to a cemetery or graveyard, but a lot of the Victorian ones are designed to be places to visit. It was quite common for Victorians to have like picnics and day outs at graveyards and things. Like they were used as almost like a public park, but you know, you could say hi to your nan on your way, or have a meal at her gravesite, for example. This time still had a lot of superstitions around death, you know, covering mirrors, opening windows. They were quite common, along with ringing bells. Bells were believed to scare away bad spirits and demons, so that kind of thing was still being done. Rosemary is a herb that symbolises remembrance. It's my favourite herb actually. It tastes amazing, it smells great, and it also signifies remembrance, which I think is beautiful. And I learned that in year 9 when I was reading an Edgar Allan Poe poem, which is my favourite of his poems, and it's called The Sleeper. It's really nice. It was also believed that the women, again, it's still women's work, the women of the family, so the family members of the deceased, would be around the body, so that the soul, once the person has passed, doesn't go looking for these family members. It sees that they're there with them, and then they can just go on out to where they're supposed to go. We see the fire in the room where the person has died would be extinguished. All the reflective surfaces would be covered. And windows were opened. I believe some nurses still practice this today, which I think is quite sweet. Not putting fires out, opening windows. We also have a concept of telling the bees. So telling the bees is a practice that would be done because it was believed that bees were this kind of like, they were like a spiritual kind of not of this realm beings, and so someone would go and whisper to tell them that the person had died. You'd see hives covered in black fabric to show mourning and all this kind of thing. We also had a theme of coffins being carried out the front door, feet first, so the person wouldn't have the soul wouldn't have the urge to sit up and look back at the family that they were leaving behind. We first saw a cremation in the UK, in England specifically, in 1769. That was the first modern cremation. This time, obviously, there were a lot more rules for women than there were men, especially in funeral wear. We see this a lot in the Victorian times. So men were only required to wear a black armband for a period of time as their representation of mourning, whereas the women would have to go through a whole process. They would have to wear black, they couldn't go outside, they have to be veiled, they would basically have their curtains closed or the blinds down, and then after 6 months you could start wearing dark purple and all this nonsense. But this kind of shows that a lot of the social as well as emotional work surrounding death and funerals was still on the women to do, not the men. We had mourning jewellery. Mourning jewellery was commonly done with hair of the deceased, which I think is very nice, although when I see it in antique shops I never want to buy it because I don't want to risk getting haunted. But if I did it with my own hair, because if I cut my hair I could make something. I follow someone on Instagram who makes hair jewellery. It's stunning. It's amazing what people can do, like with their braiding and the way they fix the hair in certain ways. It's a talent. Maybe when I next get my hair cut I'll be like, can I take my hair with me? I want to make something out of it, but that won't be happening now. So I just want to show these earrings. I'll see if I can put a little picture up. So these are inspired by some Victorian memento mori earrings. And you see a lot with the Victorians that skulls were commonly used as symbols of memento mori, which translates to remember you will die. Cheery topic, a little bit heavy. And this was a common theme in Victorian England. Obviously, death was everywhere. Our kind of relationship with death, we probably couldn't have been closer. Like, you could probably say like the plague was another time, but at this time people were dying and the Victorians were like, right, we need skulls everywhere. So they chucked them on everything. But their mourning jewellery is so beautiful. I have a piece myself. So this ring here, it has a letter J on it, which is for a family member of mine. And this is an actual Victorian ring. It is a black stone, I think it's onyx, with it's gold with a little golden J on it. And you would see jewellery like this frequently. There is meant to be a kind of a colour code with memorial jewellery as well. So if it was black, it indicated the person was married, and if it was white, it symbolised that the person was unmarried at death. But that's not why I've got mine black. It's because this was really pretty and it was actually my size for my finger, so that's why I have it. And at this time as well, you would see kind of the use of Whitby jet made into mourning brooches, necklaces, bracelets. I think there were some earrings as well, but different things like this were very popular. And I suppose it also ties into the fact that there was a lot of societal pressure on the mourning process, along with having a good funeral still. And also industrialization. You saw kind of an uptake in people wanting specific things for the funeral. So we had funeral clothing, but also the stuff that was given out at funerals. There was a case of like a priest's wife or something being given so many different pairs of gloves, scarves, you know, just loads of black funeral wear. She just had so many of them because they were given out at funerals. And then from the 1900s, or the early 1900s, we go into this period of 1900 to 2000. So in this time, you know, we have 2 world wars, and because of these, we kind of changed our outlook and perspective on how we dealt with death. At this time, it was no longer, oh, we spend a while with the body in the house and then we go through this long process of the funeral and all that kind of thing. We would now commonly see less traditions being carried out during this funeral process. And also at this point, dying was seen as an embarrassment to medical science. So doctors just tended to ignore the dying and the dead as like, oh, we don't know how to stop this. Like, they were embarrassed that people were dying and that they were dead. So we had a complete change in the outlook and perspective on how we treated the dead and the dying. Funerals were becoming more and more private. So obviously I mentioned earlier that the rich started ticketing funerals to try and prevent people to turn up. But now funerals are becoming more intimate, more private, with only normally family and friends. And we were seeing an uptake in cremation. Obviously not everyone will potentially want an open casket or anything like that, especially after the 2 world wars. If your loved one was sent home, you're probably not going to want to see them in the condition that they were in or what was left of them. So it would make sense that cremation would become more and more popular during this time. Also, it can be fairly effective, like time-wise. It depends on the temperature, but we don't need to get into the the logistics for how easy it is to burn a body. We still had little traditions that carried on. So we still had funeral tea, kind of like a wake, that kind of thing, you know. Little traditions still remained, but it was never as kind of serious or kind of necessary as it was back in like the 1200s and the 1500s. And at this time as well, we saw a rise in undertakers and mortuary technicians, so it was becoming more of a man's job rather than the role being carried out by a woman as it had been done for hundreds of years previously. And that brings us to now, where we now have a range of techniques for burial. You have many an option. I would like a natural burial personally, but you have things like aquamation, cremation, you could be embalmed, although I don't think people are being embalmed as much now because it can be a little bit dodgy for the environment, but I mean cremation can be as well, I suppose. And you have different preservation methods and options really on what you want to do with your body. But still now we have a very detached relationship with death. It's a thing, obviously, because it is so sad and brings up loads of emotions. No one wants to speak about it because no one wants to be reminded of the time when they've lost a loved one. It's very difficult to get over. I know from personal experience it can be tricky. Like it's been, how long has it been now? It's like 2009, for example. That was a time I lost a family member. I still get upset over that now. I was 6 years old then. I'm almost 23. So it can be difficult, but at the same time, I believe we need to talk about it more. I think we have such a distaste and a phobia of talking about these things and talking about death because we don't want to touch it, we don't want to experience it, we don't want to acknowledge it because we still feel like it's something we can put over there. It's like we don't have to think about it until it happens type thing. But I believe that we need to have an open conversation and we need to try and take a little bit more of a death positive outlook on life. Maybe I'm overthinking slightly. Maybe I'm a little bit too passionate about a potentially non-issue, but it's something that's important to remember. As someone who is in this area of kind of knowledge, I think it's always something to keep in mind as we refer to people who are dead, who are no longer with us. That's another one. So I know this has been a fairly morbid topic and I didn't expect my little rant at the end, but I really hope you've learned something. I really hope that maybe your outlook may change. Maybe you feel a little bit less uncomfortable with the concept of death and dying. Not that this is going to be some remarkable kind of instant switch. It takes a lot of work to get yourself out of those negatives, but obviously as someone now who this is my niche, this is my area of expertise, I feel really passionate about it and I hope you find a little bit of passion in it too. Anyway, thank you for watching. I will hopefully see you in the next one. I am wishing you all the best in your life and in your death. I've been Amelie. This has been Death Rambles. Thank you very much. I will see you again. Bye bye.